So I was reading the book Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino the other day, and I got maybe a quarter of the way through it when all of a sudden I realized, hey, I don't know what reading is. Like, sure, I know how to read, but what exactly am I doing? Like, what is going on here as I read this book? While I may be stupid, this wasn't just some random delusional thought. It was something the book seemed to be asking me as I read it. So I kept on reading, hoping that maybe it would eventually provide some profound revelation about the nature of reading, but that just never came. So now I'm even more confused than when I started. So hey, let me tell you about it, and maybe by the end we'll both be confused about reading. Before we go and forget what reading is, a bit of context. Here's the opening lines of the book. Kublai Khan does not necessarily believe everything Marco Polo says when he describes the cities visited on his expeditions, but the Emperor of the Tartars does continue listening to the young Venetian with greater attention and curiosity than he shows any other messenger or explorer of his. In the lives of emperors, there's a moment which follows pride in the boundless extensions of territories we have conquered, and the melancholy and relief of knowing we shall soon give up any thought of knowing and understanding them. A couple of things about this passage. Firstly, Marco Polo comes to Kublai Khan as a storyteller. Kublai Khan is in turn a listener. They're a writer and a reader. And this tracks. The bulk of the book is just Marco Polo telling the Khan about the cities he's visited. He's narrating stories. Secondly, notice the word we, the territories we have conquered, knowing we shall soon give up any thought of understanding them. We, you, and I are emperors, evil emperors, ruling over our domain of studio apartment, grocery store, and local park with 2 trees. Jokes aside, in being identified as emperors, we're identified as readers. As we read the book talks to us, the reader, through Kublai Khan. Thirdly, check out the first line again. Kublai Khan doesn't believe what Marco Polo says, but he still listens. Marco Polo tells lies or fictions. So even from the very first sentence, the book is asking us about fiction. What do we make of it when we know it's not real? And that's kind of the foundation of why reading gets so weird. So the book is structured like this. Each chapter is made up of a bunch of short descriptions of cities. Sandwiching these cities at the beginning and end of each chapter, Marco Polo and Kublai Khan have conversations about travel and storytelling and stuff. The end bit of chapter 2 is when I actually started questioning what reading is. It starts like this. Newly arrived and quite ignorant of the languages of the Levant, Marco Polo could only express himself by drawing objects from his baggage. Drums, saltfish, necklaces of warthog's teeth, and pointing to them with gestures, leaps, cries of wonder or of horror. This is, of course, the original and fundamental unit of storytelling. Kublai Khan tries to read into the objects and gestures. An hourglass could mean time passing, or time past, or sand, or a place where hourglasses are made. Storytelling, fiction, is an attempt at communication through signs, and of course we could only read into signs what we already know about the object or gesture. So in some sense, reading is about what we already know. As time went by, words began to replace objects and gestures in Marco's tales. The foreigner had learned to speak the emperor's language, or the emperor to understand the language of the foreigner. Now we get into what we normally think of as reading. Language helps us bridge the gap of naive communication when we don't know what the other person is trying to say, by laying down some rules for both of us, writer and reader, speaker and listener. We can now talk with way more precision. Cool, so reading is just when a writer captures an idea or object into language, which then, through our common framework, we can just decode back into whatever it is the writer wanted us to read. But notice here, the language is either the emperor's or Polo's. There's a compromise to reading. Either we give a bit of our own personal understanding of the world so we can play in language, or we force others to give up theirs. The fact that once language is established, we can't tell who gave up what suggests a sort of irreversible loss upon gaining language. This is now the only way we can think and it may not even be our own. But you would have said communication between them was less happy than in the past. Day after day, evening after evening, words failed Polo, and little by little, he went back to relying on gestures, grimaces, glances. And here we run into the problem. If reading really is just a regurgitation of data, then why is the Khan so interested in Marco Polo stories when he was just pulling stuff out of the bag? It was precisely because the imprecision. Reading is good because we don't know what the writer is saying. It's not a one-way flow of information, it's a negotiation. It's the uncertain symbols, the negative spaces around the text that make reading what it is. In order to read, we have to abandon language. And as the vocabulary of things was renewed with new samples of merchandise, the repertory of mute comment tended to become closed, stable. The pleasure of falling back on it diminished in both. In their conversations, most of the time, they remained silent and immobile. But of course, as we live longer and learn more, we reach a point where once uncertain symbols become a language of their own. It's like Pandora's box has been opened. Everything is a language now. The rose stands in for love. So how do we return to where we were before language? It's impossible. All we can do is not communicate at all. Sure, there's another person there in the process of reading, but they don't really say anything. Once we move past the basic rote information, everything we do as we read takes place in our own heads. Even this interpretation right now that I'm basing this whole video off of. I'm just kind of making this up. And yeah, that seems to be what reading is, just making stuff up. Let's not even talk this kind of interpretation. Have you ever just imagined what a character looks like? Compare that mental image to the text and notice how much you're filling in, how much you're just making up. That's reading. Sure, it's prompted by the text, but it's not the text. It is sitting silent, immobile, and imagining. So I began wondering, is there a limit to this? How far can we stray to have it still count as reading? What is the exact relation between the stuff I'm just making up and the text itself? What is allowed and why? What isn't allowed? What is reading? End of chapter 4. Kublai Khan. I've constructed in my mind a model city from which all possible cities can be deduced. It contains everything corresponding to the norm. Since the cities that exist diverge in varying degrees from the norm, I need only foresee the exceptions to the norm and calculate the most probable combinations. So maybe this is a limit on reading. We invent a norm and see how well the text fits into it. This may not seem to make much sense, but remember middle school language arts class when your teacher drew this diagram on the board? Inciting incident, rising action, climax, resolution. Or maybe you're into Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, and you've been applying that structure maybe a bit more than you should. Or how about what I'm going to call the TV trope school of analysis, where rather than a single concrete structure, we have a set of familiar tropes, using which we can categorize any work of art, any narrative as either affirming or subverting. Does it have a redemption arc, enemies to lovers, comic relief character? So that silent non-communication is us fitting a text into a model where it can be understood. Marco Polo. I have also thought of a model city from which I deduce all others. It is a city made only of exceptions, exclusions, incongruities, contradictions. If such a city is the most improbable, by reducing the number of abnormal elements, we increase the probability that the city really exists. But I cannot force my operation beyond a certain limit. I would achieve cities too probable to be real. Notice how normality is restored in Marco Polo City in his story. He removes elements. It's a negative normality. To be normal is to be less. To be at all is to be exceptional. The cities or stories too probable to be real are those that have had too much removed from them that they barely even exist at all. Now, this isn't to say that any two stories are totally unique and impossible to compare. It's just that in comparing them, we can't create a mediating trope. So a book might feature a character who goes from being bad to good, but once we slot it into the overarching model of redemption arc with all the baggage and norms that comes with it, we cease to read at all. Instead, we end up peeling away the idiosyncrasies of the text, all the things that make it what it is, and at the end of the operation, almost nothing remains. In the beginning of chapter 8, Kublai Khan says, "Hey, instead of listening to you recounting your experience, let's play some chess. I'll just interpret the moves of cities, somehow." Marco Polo reluctantly agrees, so they play and play until it reaches a point where, by disembodying his conquest to reduce them to the essential, Kublai had arrived at the extreme operation, the definitive conquest, of which the empire's multiform treasures were only illusory envelopes. It was reduced to a square of planed wood, nothingness. Here, the chessboard represents the plight of gamers. After a 17-hour gaming session, we are reduced to that nothingness. The game becomes mechanical, and it is as though we ourselves are not there at all. Okay, not really, but actually not too far off from my actual read. The chessboard here acts as an inward turn. Unlike the ideal model, which is something outside the story must conform to, the chess generates the story. It is like a language, however, it differs from a language in that it has strict, well-defined, and relatively few rules. Through chess, reading becomes identifying a series of mechanical functions: e4, e5, king, e2. Its abstract internal structure is revealed. In a sense, I'm doing this right now to the book Invisible Cities. I'm turning it into a game of chess where certain symbols stand in for other things and move in a sort of predetermined way. Cities and stories, emperors and listeners. And maybe that's why I've become so lost. I'm inching ever closer to the conclusion that reading is nothing at all. We pick up this thought at the end of chapter 8. Marco Polo says, "The square on which your enlightened gaze is fixed was cut from the ring of a trunk that grew in a year of drought. You see how its fibers are arranged. Here is a thicker pore, perhaps it was a larvum's nest, a caterpillar that gnawed the leaves and was the cause of the tree being chosen for chopping down. This edge was scored by the woodcarver with his gouge so that it would adhere to the next square, more protruding. The quantity of things that could be read into a little piece of smooth and empty wood overwhelmed Kublai. Polo was already talking about the ebony forests, about rafts laden with logs that come down rivers, of docks, of women at windows." Here, Marco Polo, the storyteller himself, says, "Relax. You don't need to try so hard. Sure, we can play chess, but we can also just admire the board. What is the board in my analysis? Maybe the prose, or maybe the physical book itself, or maybe the weird, funny stuff in the book that contain and contextualize the quotes I'm pulling out to analyze. Maybe all of these things. Maybe none of them. It doesn't matter. Just don't get too locked into abstraction. Remember that on some level, the book is just what it is. It says just what it says. Even if we don't know exactly how we came to understand it, even if we still don't know what reading is, sometimes that we are able to read is enough." I've mentioned a couple times already that even though I've been talking about the Kublai Khan conversations, most of the book is just Marco Polo describing cities. In a way, these cities act as tiny fragmentary fictions to apply what you read in the conversations to. So before you go, I'd like to read one of these cities, and I don't know, maybe you can apply some of what we've talked about. What do you think? What do you read in it? So here's the second one in the whole book, Cities and Memories 2. When a man rides a long time through wild regions, he feels the desire for a city, Finally, he comes to Isidora, a city where the buildings have spiral staircases encrusted with seashells, where perfect telescopes and violins are made, where the foreigner, hesitating between two women, always encounters a third, where cockfights degenerate into bloody brawls among betters. He was thinking of all these things when he desired a city. Isidora, therefore, is the city of his dreams, with one difference. The dreamed-of city contains him as a young man. He arrives at Isidora in his old age. In the square, there's a wall where the old men sit and watch the young go by. He is seated in a row with them. Desires are already memories.